This building on Saint-Denis Street in Montreal's Latin Quarter is typical of many of its time, with its grey stone facade and historicist architectural style. Emblematic? Yes. Attractive? Yes. But it's more than that. Pause and take a closer look. It features distinctive sculptures and other decorative details. To be sure, those sculptures need a good cleaning and some restoration. Nevertheless, the quality of the architectural design and the craftsmanship are apparent. Is this just decoration for its own sake, or is there some deeper meaning or history lesson behind these details? That's the question I seek to answer in this video. The words Franco-American on the entrance lintel offers the most obvious place to start with trying to decode this building. With those words and the building's address, I found a few online articles and social media posts revealing that this is a 19th century building, originally the home of a guy named Napoleon Bourassa. It is generally known as the Franco-American Building, the Napoleon Bourassa House, or just Bourassa House for short, and their equivalents in French. With research, I've been able to more or less decode the building's ornamentation and learn some interesting local history along the way. I think the best way into this story is to start with the mascaron just below the balcony. A 2003 article in Le Devoir, a Montreal newspaper, suggests that it's a depiction of none other than Leonardo da Vinci. There doesn't seem to be documentary proof of this, but I think it's a very apt explanation. First, let's look at the visual evidence. That sculpted face looks a lot like the one in Portrait of a Man in red chalk, the image at the right, which is attributed to da Vinci as a self-portrait. It has served as a model for many depictions of da Vinci. Could it be the inspiration here too? Yes, I think so, but my reasons go beyond the resemblance. It's because da Vinci would be the perfect symbol for this building and the man behind it. As I mentioned, the original owner was Napoleon Bourassa. Bourassa was a painter, sculptor, architect, novelist, and art critic who spent several years studying art in Italy. In Montreal, his work included designing churches and the artwork in them. In other words, Bourassa was a quintessential Renaissance man, so it would stand to reason that he would admire da Vinci and would put him in a place of honor on his building. Although I haven't found an authoritative source that identifies Bourassa as the building's architect, I'm convinced that at the very least, he had a major role in its design. The Quebec National Fine Arts Museum has a series of architectural elevations, sections, and floor plans of this building credited to Bourassa. He lived here, but only in part of the building. Even though I'm calling this a house, it had 4 apartments. This was more than a residence, it was a money-making venture too. In 2008, an architectural historian identified Bourassa House as a precursor to Montreal's first apartment building, which was built 6 years later. So, we can add entrepreneur and innovator to Bourassa's list of occupations. Bourassa completed the building about 1880, but he and his family had been rooted in this area for years. Next door, a decade earlier, Bourassa built a smaller house in 1869. On this 1881 map, I've added a blue arrow pointing to the first Bourassa house and a green arrow pointing to the second. This undated photo of the second Bourassa house shows part of what was probably the earlier one on the left. The first, 1869 Bourassa house, was later replaced by an apartment building. Bourassa's studio was also located on the same property. I've added a purple arrow to the 1881 map identifying the studio. Here's a later painting of the studio interior by Joseph Charles Francher. Okay, with that site history covered, let's get back to decoding the building.
What about that sculpture group above the entry?
Let's start with the central figure, clearly marked as an angel with wings, and a face I think we could call angelic. Some sources suggest that this is a representation of Bourassa's wife, Azali, who died in 1869, aged 34, about 10 years before this sculpture was executed. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that the angel symbolizes her watching over the family. Unlike the Da Vinci above, I think this is more a figurative than a literal likeness, but you can judge for yourself. Below the angel are 2 female figures. According to Anne Bourassa, Napoleon's granddaughter, they are allegories of art and history, while others label them as painting and sculpture or art and industry.
The one on the right has a painter's palette, so she seems to represent painting or art. The one on the left has a mallet. To me, this one seems to represent sculpture. There's someone else. Behind the elbow of the figure on the left, there's a head in profile. Who is that, and what's he doing here? This is a bust of Bourassa's father-in-law, Louis-Joseph Papineau, a major figure in Quebec history. Papineau is perhaps best remembered for his role in a failed rebellion against British colonial rule in 1837. He was a wealthy man and had owned the land where Bourassa House was built. He passed away in 1871. Why is Papineau's head in the background and not more prominent? I wonder if it reflects a certain ambivalence. Papineau was widely admired in the French-Canadian community, so it made sense for Bourassa to pay tribute to his children's famous grandfather. On the other hand, it's widely reported that Papineau disapproved of his daughter marrying Bourassa, and that the two men didn't always get along. Might that explain why Papineau is somewhat hidden? I'm inclined to think the contrast between the placement of Da Vinci and Papineau tells us about Bourassa's sentiments. There's another question about these sculptures. Who designed them? Napoleon Bourassa's granddaughter, Anne, attributes them to him in a biography of her grandfather. However, some experts have stated that it was probably the work of Philippe Hébert, a sculptor who apprenticed with Bourassa from 1873 to 1879 and went on to a prominent career. When Hébert established his own practice, he initially worked in a space within Bourassa's studio before getting his own in 1884. So, which one should we credit with this work? I haven't solved this mystery, but I think a reasonable guess is that the sculpture work on Bourassa House was some type of collaboration between the two. The evidence for Bourassa having a hands-on role is that this was his project, and the sculptures are shown in his elevation drawing of the building. Also, Bourassa later sculpted similar-looking busts of Papineau. As for Hébert, he was working alongside Bourassa when this building was being designed and constructed. Bourassa could have called upon Hébert to either take on this work independently, or, perhaps, carry out a concept from Bourassa. Consider this precedent. A similar sculptural group from 1875 credited to both of them. Incidentally, earlier, in 1874, Hébert did this bust of Papineau. There's one last detail about this building to cover. Above some of the windows, there is a stylized monogram fusing a B with a backwards P. The obvious interpretation is that it's for Bourassa and Papineau. Again, Bourassa acknowledges his in-laws, but not quite on equal footing with his own identity. Although I'm not going to fully cover the later history of Bourassa House, there are a few points worth noting. Napoleon Bourassa's youngest child, Henri Bourassa, who lived here for several years, became a famous public figure in Quebec and founded the newspaper Le Devoir. Not coincidentally, Le Devoir has covered this building over the years. Also, Napoleon Bourassa's oldest child, his daughter Augustine Bourassa, had a successful career as a painter. The Bourassa family moved out of the building around 1884, and as far as I can tell, never lived here again. Bourassa and his Papineau in-laws also had country homes in Montebello, Quebec, and it seems Napoleon Bourassa spent more time in Montebello from 1884 on. However, he periodically returned to his studio, located behind Bourassa House. After Bourassa passed away in 1916, it became the studio of painter Adrien Hébert, the son of Bourassa's protege, Philippe Hébert. Adrien occupied the studio from 1917 to 1946, when it was torn down. Getting back to Bourassa House, among its later occupants, from at least the 1890s to the 1950s, part of it was occupied by dental and medical offices, using the name Franco-American, which explains why those words were added to the building. Here's a 1939 map labeling the Franco-American building and the painter's studio behind it. In the 1920s, dental practice advertisements featured the sculpture group. Although Bourassa House is often overlooked, and there have been complaints going back at least 20 years about its condition, the building has its fans. For example, here's a 2012 drawing by Montreal artist Shari Blaukoff that she published on her blog. A link to her post is in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the backstory of this beloved, albeit underappreciated building. Thanks for watching. For more information, please see the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe.